How to make, or how I made, a live edge red oak slab desk with a custom metal base. Let's get into it. How about we crack on with the metal base first? I started with the leg framework by cutting 2" by 2" cold rolled metal square tubing down to 10 5/16 at a 15-degree angle on one end 8 times. Then cut the same tubing down to 1 foot and 3 inches with 2 opposing 15-degree ends 4 times. These would create the bases for the frame. I gave them each a mineral spirit rub before grinding the edge of the butt jointing pieces to roughly 45 degrees to create a well for the weld. Then tack welded the first frame together before running my first welds. Sloppy but effective welds complete, I ground them down to be flush with the tubing surface. I ran through the same process 3 more times to create the upper and lower frames for each leg. With the 4 frames ready, I cut 2 28-inch lengths to serve as the vertical supports for the legs, then tack welded them to the frames before running welds on every joining edge. Then ground the welds flush. I repeated the same process to create the second leg frame. The interior vertical supports were cut to 24 inches and went through the same tack, weld, and grind process. Throughout the welding process, my MIG welder seemed to struggle with keeping its voltage to wire feed ratio consistent, creating thicker, beadier welds in some places that would require second passes, and I'm not entirely sure why yet. To join the 2 legs to create the frame, I used some clamps and mounting supports to align the 4-foot 8-inch crossbeam before, you guessed it, going through the tack, weld, and grinding process once more. To anchor the base to the wooden desktop, I cut 2 7-inch plates from what I'd say is about 1/8-inch steel. Then sank 3 recesses in each, the holes being oversized for the lag screws to allow the desk the ability to float as it adapts to its new environment while still being secured to the base. Then ground down any roughness left by the drill, created the weld bevel, and tacked, welded, and ground the plates to the frame. With the base in good shape, let's switch gears to the slab top. I started by selecting and cutting 2 slabs of air-dried red oak from my stack. I cut them a little over 6 feet to accommodate how the later machining might affect the final desired dimension of 6 feet. I had to opt for the beam saw to meet the depth. Then, after setting a straight edge, I carefully cut the interior edges that would join the 2 slabs together. With the rough dimensions in, it was time to get these guys level. I opted to do the show side of each slab one at a time to help mitigate material waste. Using the router caddy as my guide, I figured out where our low points, twists, cups, etc. were, then used shims and hot glue to set the slab to meet the router as evenly as possible to again mitigate wasted depth. With a 1 3/4 inch planing bit, I got to work flattening the show sides of the slabs. With a decently flat side ready, I clamped the 2 slabs in alignment and marked where I would sink some dominoes to join them together. Then, with the Festool domino jointer, cut 4 recesses. After that, it was time for glue up. I'm not the most pleased with my gluing setup. I had limited clamps large enough for the width and I should have used some cauls to assist the joining, but all in all I was happy with the outcome. Once cured, I flipped and flipped and flipped and flipped the slab over. Before what I'll call lightly flattening the underside of the desk, just enough to make the contact points with the base flat. Then I got to work cleaning up the edge bark. Luckily, my missing draw knife wasn't too much of a hindrance as the sapwood was quick work to cut through with just the large chisel. Then I got to work on the first rough sand to get rid of all of the first strike machining marks. In good shape, I got to work filling all of the large surface knots and checks. I filled this big check too that would later also get a bottom surface bow tie to hold it in place. I also used blue tape to keep the SA glue from overrunning its borders. After the glue cured, I sanded back the bubbling on the surface. Trimmed the ends flush. And then got to work stabilizing the slab from below. I marked 5 places I thought needed the help of a bow tie. Then filled the remaining knots in small holes. From a scrap piece of red oak, I drew and cut out the bow ties. For each placement, I marked the outer edges of the bow ties, use a router to clear most of the recess, tidied up the edges with a chisel and mallet, filled the recess with glue, sank the bow tie, then used a Japanese saw to cut them flush. With all 5 bow ties in, it was time for the finishing level sand down. The slab, after going through an 80, 120, 240 sanding process, was still missing the port the client requested for wires to pass through. I marked the center of the slab toward the top of the desk and measured 3 inches on either side. Then set the router caddy we used to flatten the slab square, anchored it, and used it as a cut guide to clear the port. I could only make it part of the way through, being limited by the length of the router bit shank, but I improvised. Using a Forstner bit to clear a space all the way through the hole, I then used a trimming router bit to clear the last 1/4 inch or so of the porthole. After that, I used a Dremel and sandpaper to clean up some burn marks. Before adding a chamfer to the bottom edge of the port and a 1/2 inch roundover to the top. With all the cuts done, it was time for finishing. Using Aquacoat, I filled the wood grain to lay the groundwork for a more uniform finish. I applied 3 coats, scuff sanding between each one. After that, it was time for several layers of satin sheen lacquer. I applied, allowed to cure, scuff sanded, wiped down, and reapplied for every layer of lacquer, sans the last one. With the slab ready, it was time to finish the metal base. Wiping the whole thing down with mineral spirits, then sanding away any surface discrepancy, I prepped the piece for several layers of matte black spray paint. Each coat I applied very lightly to avoid runs in the paint as much as possible. Once that dried, I sank some plastic feet into the open ends of the tubing to help protect its future home's floor. And applied some furniture pads on either end for good measure. With the base done, the last thing to do was anchor the slab. Using the plate holes as my guide, I pre-drilled some room for the lag bolts before ratcheting them tight. And that's a wrap. Thanks so much for watching. I love putting these edits together of my projects, but it is a lot of work. If you enjoyed the build or have been around my channel for a while, consider joining us on Patreon to help support the regular content and get access to some fun behind-the-scenes Easter eggs too. Next time, this same air-dried red oak gets put to use as yet another crib for my soon-to-be newest nephew. Until next time.